Here's something every major religion has in common, and it's not love, not peace, not salvation. Every single one of them, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, has a side they actively suppress. A dark chapter, a forbidden practice, a secret so uncomfortable that the official version of the religion spent centuries trying to bury it, burn it, or pretend it never happened. Not fringe cults, not splinter groups, the mainstream religions. The ones with billions of followers. The ones your parents took you to. The ones with the beautiful buildings, and the weekly services, and the carefully curated public image. All of them. Today we're going through every major religion and pulling out the specific dark side they don't want you to flirt. The rituals that got banned, the texts that got burned, the practices that happened inside the same institutions that told you they represented goodness, light, and truth. And here's the part that's going to stay with you long after this video ends. None of this is ancient history that stopped mattering. Every dark side we cover today left a fingerprint in the version of religion you can walk into this Sunday morning. By the end of this video, you won't just understand religion's forbidden history. You'll understand why institutions, every institution, will always create a version of themselves they desperately need you to believe in. And why the gap between that version and the real one is always, always worse than you think. Let's start with the religion that built the most sophisticated system for hiding its dark side in human history. Religion number 1, Christianity, the torture manual they published in God's name. There is a book, published in 1486, endorsed by the Pope, distributed across Europe by the most powerful religious institution on earth. Its instructions include how to strip a woman naked, shave her entire body, and parade her through the streets before killing her. How to use sleep deprivation until confession. How to identify guilt by swimming someone in freezing water. If they float, guilty. If they sink and drown, innocent. Congratulations, you've just met Malleus Maleficarum, the witch's hammer, the official torture manual of the Catholic Church. And it wasn't written by a fringe extremist. It was written by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor, and approved at the highest levels of the church. It became the blueprint for the systematic torture and execution of somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people across Europe, the vast majority of them women. The Inquisition, Christianity's most aggressively suppressed dark side. Here's what most people don't know about the Inquisition, because the official church history glosses over it so completely that most lifelong Christians couldn't tell you a single specific detail. It wasn't one event. It wasn't a brief moment of medieval madness that Christianity quickly moved past. It was a system, institutional, organized, running for nearly 600 years. The Spanish Inquisition alone operated from 1478 to 1834. 350 years. That's longer than the United States has existed. The process was methodical. An inquisitor would arrive in a town. A 30-day grace period, called the Edict of Grace, was announced. Come forward, confess, receive mercy. After 30 days, anyone denounced by their neighbors was arrested. Then the interrogation began. First, psychological pressure. Then increasingly severe torture, strappado, the rack, the water cure. All of it carefully documented by church officials who called themselves servants of God. Confession obtained under torture had to be repeated the following day, without torture, to be considered valid. If the accused recanted their confession, they were tortured again. And the charge didn't have to be witchcraft. Heresy was enough. Reading the wrong text, questioning the wrong doctrine, owning a Bible in a language other than Latin. The Malleus Maleficarum specifically identified women as inherently more susceptible to demonic influence because, it argued, women were mentally weaker, more lustful, and more easily corrupted. It literally said that in print. Published by the Church, distributed across Christendom. This isn't a secret discovered recently by anti-religious historians. The records are in the Vatican archives. The torture manuals are in museums. The papal endorsements are documented. And Pope John Paul II, in 1992, issued a formal apology for the Inquisition. 500 years later, the Inquisition didn't happen because Christianity attracted uniquely evil people. It happened because an institution gained enough power to define reality, and then used that power to protect itself from anyone who questioned that definition. That's not a medieval problem. That's an institutional problem. Every institution, religious, political, corporate, that gains enough power eventually develops a version of the Inquisition. a mechanism for suppressing the questions it finds inconvenient. It might not involve torture chambers, but the logic is identical. We define what is true. Questioning us is dangerous, and we have the authority to decide what happens to people who do. The question isn't whether the institutions around you do this. The question is which ones you've stopped questioning, and why. Christianity's dark side involved a system specifically designed to terrify people into compliance. But the next religion's forbidden dark side is different. It involves knowledge so dangerous that possessing it was considered a direct attack on God himself. And the scholars who pursued it anyway paid a price that makes the Inquisition look straightforward. Religion number 2, Islam. The scholars they erased from history. In 833 AD, the most powerful Islamic empire on earth launched an inquisition of its own. Not against heretics, not against Christians or Jews living under Islamic rule, against Muslim scholars. Its target was a theological position so threatening to the establishment that the Caliph, the supreme religious and political authority of the Islamic world, ordered that every scholar who disagreed with it be arrested, interrogated, and if necessary, imprisoned or executed. The position being suppressed? That the Quran was created by God, not eternal. A seemingly abstract theological question, with extremely non-abstract consequences for anyone who answered it the wrong way. This was the Mihna, Islam's forbidden inquisition, and it has been so thoroughly scrubbed from mainstream Islamic education that most Muslims today have never heard of it. But the suppression of inconvenient knowledge in Islam goes much deeper than one political purge. Meet the Mu'tazilites. The Mu'tazilites were the Islamic world's greatest rationalist theologians, active between the 8th and 10th centuries AD. They argued that reason and revelation were compatible, that the Quran should be interpreted through the lens of rational philosophy, that God, being perfectly rational, would never command something that contradicted reason. They were the Islamic Enlightenment, 1,000 years before Europe's, and they were systematically destroyed, not by outside invaders, by the Islamic establishment itself. When the political winds shifted, when a new caliph decided rationalism was a threat to orthodox authority, the Mu'tazilite scholars were hunted down. Their books were burned. Their positions were declared heretical. Their intellectual legacy was so thoroughly suppressed that the Islamic world spent the next several centuries moving in the opposite direction, toward increasingly rigid literalism rather than philosophical engagement. Scholars argue that this suppression fundamentally altered the trajectory of Islamic civilization. The rationalist tradition that might have led to an Islamic scientific revolution was extinguished, from the inside, for political and theological reasons. And then there's the forbidden Islamic occult tradition. Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra, which we covered in a previous video, was just one text. Beneath it lies an entire hidden tradition of Islamic esoteric practice, ilm al-hikmah, divine wisdom magic, talismanic science, jinn summoning rituals, documented in texts that mainstream Islamic scholars declared haram, but that continued to circulate underground for centuries. The official version of Islam has no magic, no occult practice, no supernatural negotiation with entities other than God. The actual history of Islamic civilization, documented in manuscripts that still exist, tells a considerably more complicated story. The Mu'tazilites were destroyed, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. A tradition that encouraged questioning, reasoning, and intellectual engagement with difficult texts, eliminated because the institution decided certainty was more valuable than truth. Here's the uncomfortable parallel. Every community, religious or secular, has its Mu'tazilites. The people who ask the questions that make the establishment uncomfortable. The thinkers who push against the edges of accepted belief. And every community has to decide. Do we protect the questions, or do we protect the answers? Islamic civilization made its choice in the 10th century. The consequences lasted for 1,000 years. What choice is your community making right now? And who is paying the price for it? Islam suppressed its rationalist tradition to protect orthodox authority. But the next religion's forbidden dark side isn't about suppressing questions. It's about suppressing something far more visceral. A practice so transgressive, so deliberately designed to break every social and religious rule simultaneously, that it was performed in cremation grounds at midnight. And it's still practiced today. Religion number 3, Hinduism, the sect that eats the dead. They worship in cremation grounds, at midnight, surrounded by corpses. They smear their bodies with the ash of the dead. They eat and drink from human skulls. In the most extreme documented practices, they consume human flesh. and they are Hindus.
The Agori. A sect within Shaivite Hinduism, worshippers of Shiva in his most terrifying form.
And they represent the absolute outer limit of Hinduism's forbidden dark side. Most Hindus will immediately tell you the Agori are not representative of Hinduism. And they're right, in the same way that the Inquisition was not representative of Christianity's stated values. But they exist within Hinduism, theologically coherent within a strand of Hindu philosophy, and their practices are documented, witnessed, and continuing. Here's the theology, because the Agori aren't random. They have a sophisticated philosophical framework that makes their practices internally logical. Hinduism broadly divides the world into the pure and the impure, the sacred and the profane. The Agori philosophy says, these distinctions are illusions. All is Brahman. The divine is present in everything, including what society calls disgusting, terrifying, and forbidden.
Therefore, to achieve liberation, the Agori practitioner systematically destroys every social and religious boundary. If the divine is present in a cremation ground as much as in a temple, worship in the cremation ground. If the divine is present in death as much as in life, make the dead your altar. The skull, called a kapala, is used as both a begging bowl and a drinking vessel. Rituals take place on top of corpses. Some practitioners reportedly eat flesh from bodies brought to cremation grounds, not from murder, but from the dead already there. The psychological and physical danger is documented. Practitioners report possession states, psychotic breaks, encounters with entities that traditional Hinduism warns are actively dangerous. But here's what makes the Agori specifically Hinduism's forbidden dark side, rather than just a fringe practice. The Agori lineage traces directly back to Dattatreya, one of Hinduism's most revered divine figures. Their practices derive from ancient Kapalika traditions, with roots going back over 1,000 years. This is not a modern cult. This is ancient, documented, continuous. And Hinduism's mainstream has never been able to fully excommunicate them, because theologically, the Agori can cite chapter and verse from Hindu texts to justify every practice. They are Hinduism's shadow that Hinduism cannot disown. The Agori philosophy, that the divine is present in everything, including what we find repulsive and terrifying, is one of the most radical spiritual propositions in human history. Most people build their spiritual lives around the comfortable, the beautiful, and the safe. The Agori say, you're only worshipping half of reality. Now, nobody needs to eat from a skull to engage with this idea. But the question the Agori force is real. What parts of existence do you refuse to look at? What do you call impure simply because looking at it makes you uncomfortable? And what might you be missing about reality by only engaging with the parts of it that feel safe? The Agori are extreme, deliberately, disturbingly so. But the question underneath the extremism is one every human being eventually has to answer. The Agori's forbidden practices happen in cremation grounds at the edge of Hindu society. But the next religion's forbidden dark side happened at the very center of its tradition, in texts so dangerous that rabbis debated for centuries whether ordinary people should even be allowed to read them. And what those texts describe makes everything we've covered so far look like a warm-up. Religion number 4, Judaism. The forbidden names of God, and what happens when you use them. There is a name, the real name of God. Not Yahweh. That's a pronunciation scholars invented because the actual pronunciation was so sacred it was forbidden to speak aloud. The real name, 4 Hebrew letters, the Tetragrammaton, was so powerful that the high priest of Israel was only permitted to speak it once a year, on Yom Kippur, alone, in the Holy of Holies. If he mispronounced it, he died. According to the tradition, a rope was tied to the high priest's ankle before he entered, so that if he died inside, his body could be retrieved without anyone else having to enter. That's how seriously Judaism took the power of the divine name. But the forbidden dark side of Judaism goes far deeper than protective caution around sacred language. Welcome to the Qliphoth, the forbidden side of Kabbalah that mainstream Judaism has spent centuries pretending doesn't exist. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, has an officially sanctioned side, the Sephiroth, the tree of life, the divine emanations through which God interacts with creation. Beautiful, philosophical, elevated. And then it has the other side, the Qliphoth, literally shells or husks. The dark mirror of the tree of life, a shadow structure representing the forces of impurity, chaos, and what Jewish mysticism calls the Sitra Achra, the other side. Mainstream Kabbalah acknowledges the Qliphoth's existence, but strictly forbids engagement with it. The Qliphoth represents everything separated from divine light. Engaging with it, according to the tradition, risks spiritual contamination at a level that can permanently damage the soul. But a forbidden tradition of Qliphothic practice existed anyway, documented, underground, persisting for centuries in manuscripts that Orthodox Judaism refused to acknowledge. Then there's the golem, the most famous forbidden creation in Jewish mystical history, a being made from clay, animated by writing the Hebrew word for truth, emet, on its forehead, and destroyed by erasing the first letter, leaving met, death. The most famous golem account is Rabbi Loew of Prague in the 16th century, who supposedly created a golem to protect the Jewish community from anti-Semitic attacks. Every Friday at sundown, he would deactivate it by removing the word from its forehead, because allowing a created being to exist on the Sabbath was forbidden. One Friday, he forgot. The golem went berserk, destroying everything in its path. Rabbi Loew had to chase it through the synagogue and remove the word while it was rampaging. The creation of artificial life, even for protective purposes, Judaism ultimately classified as forbidden. The Talmud permits it in theory, but surrounds it with so many restrictions that in practice it was considered one of the most dangerous forms of mystical practice possible. You were reaching into the mechanism of creation itself, and that mechanism was not designed for human hands. The forbidden side of Kabbalah, the Qliphoth, exists as the shadow of the divine structure. Mainstream Judaism says, acknowledge it exists, don't engage with it. Stay on the side of light. That's not just mystical advice. That's the most psychologically sophisticated spiritual instruction in any tradition. You don't defeat your shadow by pretending it doesn't exist, but you also don't defeat it by becoming it. Every person has a Qliphoth, the shadow self, the impulses, the darkness, the desires you won't name in polite company. The Jewish mystical tradition says, know it's there, name it, understand its structure, and then don't give it your attention, your energy, or your worship. The danger isn't knowing the darkness exists. The danger is forgetting which side of the tree you're supposed to be on. Judaism's forbidden side involves reaching into the mechanics of creation itself. But the next religion's forbidden dark side is the one that will genuinely surprise you, because this religion has built its entire public identity around peace, compassion, and nonviolence. And yet its hidden history contains one of the most disturbing examples of religion being used to justify mass killing in the 20th century. Religion number 5, Buddhism, the religion of peace that blessed the bombers. You know Buddhism, meditation, mindfulness, the middle way, nonviolence, compassion for all living beings, the Dalai Lama, Tibetan monks, peaceful temples, the most gentle major religion on earth. Now, picture a Buddhist monk in 1937 Imperial Japan, standing on an airfield, raising his hand in blessing over a fleet of fighter planes about to bomb Chinese civilian targets, smiling. Zen Buddhism and its role in Japanese militarism is the most aggressively suppressed dark side of any religion on this list, because it completely shatters the story Buddhism tells about itself. It is called Zen at War, the title of a landmark 1998 academic study by Brian Victoria, a Buddhist priest who spent decades documenting what Japanese Zen institutions did during World War II. What he found was systematic, organized, theologically justified. Zen Buddhist masters developed a philosophical framework called Bushido Zen that merged Buddhist meditation practice with samurai warrior ethics and imperial Japanese nationalism. The core argument went like this: true Zen understanding, satori, enlightenment, transcends the distinction between life and death. A fully enlightened warrior has no attachment to either living or killing. Therefore, a Zen practitioner who has truly transcended ego can kill without moral weight. The sword that kills is the sword that gives life. This wasn't a fringe position. It was taught at major Zen institutions. It was published in respected Buddhist journals. It was used to train soldiers who committed documented atrocities in China, Korea, and across the Pacific. Zen masters wrote enthusiastically about the war, about the sacred duty of Japanese imperial expansion, about Buddhism's compatibility with, even its support for, military conquest. The Soto school, the Rinzai school, both implicated, both documented. And after Japan's defeat, this history was almost completely buried. The same institutions that had enthusiastically supported the war pivoted to presenting Buddhism as the religion of peace and nonviolence that the world now recognizes. Brian Victoria's book, published by a Buddhist priest trying to reckon honestly with his own tradition, was initially met with denial, hostility, and attempts at suppression by the Japanese Buddhist establishment, which, given the subject matter, is almost darkly appropriate. But Japanese militarism is not Buddhism's only forbidden dark side. The Rohingya genocide. Buddhist monks in Myanmar, led by figures like Ashin Wiratu, called the Buddhist bin Laden by Time magazine, preaching ethnic cleansing against Muslim minorities, organizing riots, justifying killing. Buddhist majority Sri Lanka, decades of Buddhist nationalist violence against Tamil Hindus. Buddhist monks in Thailand involved in financial corruption, sexual abuse, and political violence scandals so extensive they've shaken the entire institution. None of this makes Buddhism evil. None of it invalidates meditation, or the Eightfold Path, or the genuinely profound philosophy at Buddhism's core. But it completely demolishes the idea that any religion, no matter how peaceful its founding philosophy, is immune to being weaponized by the institution built around it. The Japanese Zen masters who blessed bomber planes weren't hypocrites, at least not in their own minds. They had genuinely convinced themselves that what they were doing was philosophically consistent with Buddhist teaching. That's the most uncomfortable part of this story. Not that evil people corrupted a peaceful religion, but that thoughtful, educated, genuinely practicing Buddhists, through a process of motivated reasoning and institutional pressure, arrived at a place where blessing weapons of mass destruction felt spiritually coherent. The human capacity for motivated reasoning, for finding the philosophical justification for what we already want to do, is not limited to any religion, any culture, or any century. Every belief system you hold is vulnerable to it. The question is, who in your life is holding up a mirror? And are you letting them? Buddhism's dark side shows what happens when a peaceful philosophy gets captured by institutional power and nationalist politics. But the last religion on this list has the most meticulously documented forbidden dark side of any institution in human history, because they kept the records themselves. Locked in 53 miles of shelving, in a place the public is not allowed to enter. Religion number 6, Catholicism, 53 miles of secrets. In Vatican City, behind the Apostolic Palace, there is an archive. Its official name is the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Until 2019, it was called the Vatican Secret Archive, and while secret in the original Latin referred to private rather than hidden, the distinction feels academic when you understand what's inside. The archive contains 53 miles of shelving, 12 centuries of documentation, and access is restricted to credentialed scholars who must apply in advance, may only request specific documents, and are supervised at all times. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is the most extensive collection of institutional records in human history. And what it contains, what has been verified by the scholars allowed limited access, constitutes the most thoroughly documented forbidden dark side of any religion on Earth. Let's start with the documents surrounding Galileo. In 1633, Galileo Galilei was forced by the Inquisition to recant his scientific finding that the Earth orbited the Sun. He was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. His books were banned. The complete trial records, every document, every interrogation, every internal church communication are in the Vatican Archive. In 1992, 359 years after the trial, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged the church had been wrong. The documents proving they knew they were wrong significantly earlier than 1992 are also in the archive. Then there are the documents surrounding the Concordat of 1933, the legal agreement between the Vatican and Adolf Hitler's Nazi government, signed just months after Hitler came to power. An agreement that gave the Catholic Church protections for its institutions in Germany in exchange for political legitimacy it lent the Nazi regime at a critical moment. The full diplomatic communications surrounding the Concordat, what the Vatican knew, what was negotiated, what was deliberately overlooked, are in the archive. Pope Pius XII and his relationship with the Holocaust, the most contested question in modern Catholic history. Was he a secret protector of Jews, as the Church maintains? Or did he deliberately maintain silence while millions died to protect church interests? The documents are in the archive. In 2020, Pope Francis opened the Pius XII files to researchers. What scholars found was complicated. Evidence of both behind-the-scenes rescue efforts and evidence of a calculated diplomatic silence in the face of documented atrocities. Both things were true simultaneously. And the Church had access to both sets of documents for 70 years before allowing anyone else to see them. But perhaps the most devastating documents in the Vatican Archive are the ones relating to clerical sexual abuse. Internal church communications, dating back decades, documenting bishops who knew about priests abusing children, transferred those priests to new parishes instead of reporting them to authorities, and actively managed the cover-up as an institutional priority. These documents, subpoenaed in civil litigation across multiple countries, revealed a systematic pattern of institutional self-protection over victim protection that reached the highest levels of church administration. The Pope's representative in the United States, in internal documents, referred to abuse claims as imprudent and unwise to pursue legally. The archive holds the record of what the institution knew and when it knew it, and what it chose to do with that knowledge. 53 miles of shelving. The Vatican Archive is the most honest metaphor for what every powerful institution eventually becomes: a carefully managed archive of the gap between its public story and its private reality. Every organization has a Vatican Archive, a set of internal communications, decisions, and documents that would fundamentally change how outsiders see it if they were made public. The question is never whether the gap exists. The question is how wide it is, and whether the people inside the institution have been inside long enough to stop noticing. What gap are you inside right now? What documents, metaphorical or otherwise, are you storing 53 miles away from anyone who might ask inconvenient questions? That's not a question about religion. That's a question about every institution any of us belongs to, including the ones we'd prefer not to examine.